On July 23, 1981, Japan's most formidable Yakuza godfather passed away at the age of 68 from a heart attack. It wasn't a lethal encounter or a well-thought-out attempt on his life by a rival faction that took him, just a sudden heart failure. Taoka Kazuo died quietly in a hospital bed, a peaceful end to his life and career that stood in stark contrast to the dangerous, high-stakes profession that he had mastered and dominated over the past few decades. Safe to say, for a man who turned a small, local gang into a multi-billion-dollar underworld organization, it probably wasn't the kind of dramatic conclusion that many might have anticipated. But while Taoka Kazuo's end was quiet, the fallout was thunderous. His passing was the first domino to fall, triggering a chain reaction that would ignite the largest, most sustained criminal conflict in Japanese history. A struggle for succession that didn't just reshape the underworld, but one that left an indelible mark on Japan itself. This is the full story of the Yama-Ichi War, the Yakuza conflict that changed everything. You know, when I released my documentary on the full history of the Yamaguchi-Gumi, which, by the way, nearly 2 million of you have now seen, thank you very much, there was one chapter that I always felt like it deserved its own spotlight. In that video, the Yama-Ichi War represented a major milestone, but due to the sheer scope of the syndicate's century-long story, we had to move quickly. But today, we are reversing that lens. In essence, today's video is the inverted version of my previous work. We're going to focus almost entirely on the intricate details of the Yama-Ichi War, while keeping the broader Yamaguchi-Gumi history short and concise. So hey, whether you need a quick reminder of the context, or you're looking for a quick overview before we dive into the deep end, let's go ahead and establish the background of the conflict that changed everything. The man at the heart of this entire prelude is, of course, Taoka Kazuo. Born in 1913, third boss of the Yamaguchi-Gumi syndicate out of Kobe, Japan. Now, Taoka was a bit of a miracle worker for this organization. He took over at its absolute lowest point after World War II and over the next few decades turned it into the most formidable force the Japanese underworld had ever seen. By the early 80s, Taoka was running a literal empire. We're talking over 500 different subgroups, roughly 13,000 members, 2,500 businesses across the globe, both legal and illegal. But the bottom line, they were pulling in over $460 million per year. Simply put, Taoka Kazuo had taken a local Kobe gang and turned it into a corporate powerhouse that would make a Fortune 500 CEO blush. But that isn't even the biggest reason why his death was such a massive deal. His passing in 1981 kicked off a situation that the top brass of the Yamaguchi-Gumi had been sweating for a while. Who takes the throne next? At first, there was actually a pretty solid plan in place. The organization's number 2 man at the time was Yamamoto Kenichi, aka Yama-Ken. He was the logical choice. He knew the books, he knew the players, and he was a heavy hitter in his own right. There was just one small problem. He was sitting in a jail cell when Taoka Kazuo died, and unfortunately for the Yamaguchi-Gumi, he would never see the outside of those walls ever again. 7 months after his boss passed, Yama-Ken also passed away. Liver failure. Apparently, he was as formidable a drinker as he was a leader. And so, the Yamaguchi-Gumi was left with a massive, gaping hole at the top. With the boss gone and his handpicked successor following him shortly after, Taoka's wife Fumiko stepped in as the interim leader. Now, a woman running the biggest crime syndicate in Japan, that was absolutely unheard of. But Fumiko was a powerhouse in her own right and had the respect of the entire rank and file. Still, everyone knew that she was just there to keep the seat warm, basically. Her main job was to oversee the search for a permanent successor following the death of Yama-Ken. And that search is exactly where the seeds of the Yama-Ichi War were planted. The Yamaguchi-gumi found itself in a tricky situation. It was kind of like a ship without a captain. While the well-respected widow Humiko did a great job at keeping the spiritual authority of her late husband alive, the actual heavy lifting was soon left in the hands of an elite inner circle of 8 men, the top brass of the syndicate. These were the power players who would soon decide if the empire survived or crumbled. Among these 8, names like Oda Hideyomi, Nakanishi Kazuo, and Kamoda Shigemasa held massive sway. And actually, the organization managed to grow under this leadership. Around 13,000 people were members of the organization during the reign of this elite group, a then record number that almost made it seem like an actual boss at the top might not be necessary after all. But as the months rolled by, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a leadership by committee situation after all. Because in the end, the organization was split down the middle with 2 very similar, yet very different men emerging as the favorites for the title of 4th generation leader of the Yamaguchi-gumi. In one corner, you had Yamamoto Hiroshi, a close associate of the late Yamaken, and a man who made a name for himself within the organization by leading the gang's successful expansion into Japan's Kyushu region during the early 1960s. He was more of a bureaucrat who knew how to run the business side of things, which also put him in stark contrast to his main competitor. Takenaka Masahisa, close friend of the Taoka family, extremely popular, but also extremely aggressive. He was your classic militant gangster who's been to jail a couple of times for several different offenses, most of them of violent nature. So in a way, this wasn't just a professional rivalry, it was a clash of philosophies. Gangster philosophies. And while Yamamoto Hiroshi felt confident that the succession would eventually land in his lap, Taoka Fumiko and a key faction of the top brass had other plans. The 2 years between June of 1982 and June of 1984 would be some of the most pivotal in the syndicate's long history. This was when Yamamoto and Takenaka transformed from 2 leaders working to keep the ship afloat into bitter, irreconcilable rivals. A key turning point came in August of 1982, during what should have been a relaxing Obon Festival boat trip. In front of 30 high-ranking colleagues, things got a bit awkward when Takenaka publicly declared that he would never support Yamamoto's bid for the throne. And from that moment on, the masks were off. Throughout 1983, the rivalry took a turn for the theatrical, as Takenaka was fighting a war on 2 different fronts, the internal power struggle and an ongoing tax evasion case that eventually saw him indicted in September of that year. With his biggest competitor behind bars, Yamamoto smelled a golden opportunity. He began lobbying and campaigning for the spot harder than ever before, trying to lock in his support while Takenaka was out of sight. But along the way, he hit one major roadblock: Taoka Fumiko. You see, the widow didn't just respect Takenaka, she saw the aggressive, unrelenting spirit of her late husband in him. She made her stance crystal clear, decreeing that no successor should be chosen while Takenaka was still in jail. So, over the next several months, the organization effectively split in half. High-ranking members were now forced to rally either behind the measured, business-savvy Yamamoto or the dangerous, unpredictable Takenaka. And by the summer of 1984, tensions had reached a boiling point. Takenaka was released from jail in June of that year. Finally, the 4th generation boss of the Yamaguchi-gumi would be decided through voting. In total, 104 bosses within the Yamaguchi-gumi were eligible to cast their votes. The result? 28 abstentions, 76 votes, 19 of which went to Yamamoto. The remaining 57 votes gave Takenaka a landslide win. He was the successor to the legendary Taoka Kazuo, and that didn't sit right with large chunks of the organization. When Takenaka Masahisa announced his succession on June the 5th, only around half of the invited leaders showed up. As for the other half, most of them were across town holding their own parallel meeting. Led by a furious Yamamoto Hiroshi, these defectors didn't just skip the ceremony. The following day, they removed the iconic diamond-shaped Yamaguchi-Gumi emblem from their office. And a week later, they formed their own breakaway organization led by Yamamoto Hiroshi. They called it Ichiwakai. Little fun fact, Ichiwakai was apparently never supposed to be the name. The correct reading was intended to be Kazuwakai. The founders combined the Kazu from Taoka Kazuo with the character Wa, which ironically enough means harmony. But then when the media first broke the story of the split, they went with the alternative reading of that first character, Ichi. Because the news reports were already out and the name had stuck in the public's mind, everyone decided to just roll with it. And so the name Ichiwakai was born out of a simple mistake. But regardless of the name, on paper, walking away from what was the most powerful syndicate in Japan looked like a pretty bad idea. But the reality was actually a lot more complicated. Out of the 13,000 plus members that made up the Yamaguchi-Gumi at the time, more than half chose to side with Yamamoto Hiroshi. And so, in a span of just a few days, one of the top 3 largest Yakuza organizations in the entire country was created. And with that, the Yamaguchi-Gumi had officially split in 2. The divorce was over, sides were taken, lines were drawn, and the quiet era of Taoka Kazuo was about to be replaced by the loudest Yakuza conflict Japan had ever seen. From here on out, the situation escalated at breakneck speed. On July the 10th, the Yamaguchi-Gumi held the official succession ceremony for their new boss. They pushed forward with the ritual despite the police literally entering the venue to request a cancellation, fearing the tensions between them and the Ichiwakai. By late August, the rivalry had become national news when NHK aired a special titled Yamaguchi-Gumi: The Untold Story. On camera, both sides tried to play it cool. Nakanishi Kazuo of the Yamaguchi-Gumi claimed that a conflict was quote-unquote impossible to predict, while the Ichiwakai's Kamoda stated that they wouldn't initiate contact, but would certainly fight if the other side came to them. The irony, by the time that special aired, the rivalry had already claimed its first victim. Back on August the 5th, less than 2 months after the split, the head of a Yamaguchi-Gumi affiliated gang attacked and fatally wounded the assistant head of an Ichiwakai branch. Then came the official point of no return. On August the 23rd, Takenaka sent out a formal letter to all organizations friendly to the Yamaguchi-Gumi. And not just a memo, it was an official declaration severing any and all existing ties with the Ichiwakai and its affiliates. As the heat intensified, many Ichiwakai members started getting cold feet, and the Yamaguchi-Gumi capitalized on this immediately by promising amnesty and retirement pay for anyone willing to return. It was a pretty tempting offer, and the result was a mass exodus. The Ichiwakai, which had started with an impressive 7,000 men, plummeted to just 2,800 members, and were now dwarfed in terms of sheer numbers by a 10,000-man strong Yamaguchi-Gumi. But while things were looking dire on the surface and the Ichiwakai was losing men, they were still a force to be reckoned with. They were, after all, still one of the largest criminal organizations in Japan, regardless. And most importantly, they had been cooking up something almost as soon as they split off into their own organization. They were preparing an attack, and for their first big action against the Yamaguchi-Gumi, they aimed straight for the top. The target, none other than the 4th generation boss himself, Takenaka Masahisa. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment kind of thing. The Ichiwakai had been following him, studying him, and waiting for a moment of vulnerability for months. A specialized unit dedicated to this single objective was formed all the way back in July of 1984 at the command of Goto Eiji, one of the highest-ranking leaders within the Ichiwakai. Led by Nagano Shuichi and including 19 other members, this unit basically became Takenaka's shadow for the following 6 months. Starting in September of 1984, they began formulating a plan to take out the Yamaguchi-Gumi leadership in one fell swoop. and just a month later, they made the major breakthrough that they needed. The unit discovered that Takenaka's mistress was living in an apartment building called the Chiesheim Daini Esaka, located in Osaka's Suita City. So, to ensure that they had total eyes on their target, unit member Ishikawa Hiro actually rented a second-floor apartment inside the complex, starting in December. For the next few weeks, he conducted a high-stakes stakeout, documenting every arrival, every departure. By January of 1985, Ishikawa presented a detailed intelligence report to Goto Eiichi. However, at that point, their window was closing. The Supreme Court had just finalized a 5-month prison sentence for Takenaka on old gambling charges, which meant that they had to strike soon. So they spent the next 2 weeks in a fever pitch, practicing and planning every single move until setting a date for the attack. January 26th, 1985. That day, Takenaka had just returned from a trip to Okinawa and spent the afternoon at a ceremony in Kobe's Nara Ward, accompanied by 2 of his top executives, the Yamaguchi-Gumi's second-in-command, Nakayama Katsumasa, as well as Minami Riki, head of the affiliated Minami-Gumi, who, together with Takenaka, left for Osaka that same evening. Shortly after 9:15 p.m., they pulled up to the apartment complex in Suita City, where the Ichiwakai hitmen were already awaiting their arrival, parked in a black car, watching the entrance. And then... as Takenaka and his men stepped into the elevator, the hitmen opened fire, then disappeared from the scene. Minami succumbed to his wounds immediately. Nakayama was rushed to the hospital, but passed away less than 3 hours later. As for Takenaka, he was hit 3 times, yet somehow managed to make it back to his car on his own. His driver then sped him to a gang office in Osaka's Minami Ward, and from there he was rushed to the Osaka Police Hospital. The scene was pure chaos. Rank-and-file Yamaguchi-Gumi members packed the hallways, offering their own blood for transfusions to save their leader. Takenaka then underwent a grueling 9-hour surgery. But it was too late. At 11:25 p.m. on January 27th, he passed away. And so, in a span of one single, meticulously planned Saturday evening, the Ichiwakai had successfully eliminated the leadership of their biggest rival and the largest criminal organization in Japan. It was perhaps the single most pivotal hit in Yakuza history. And as the news hit the streets, everyone knew that this gang war hadn't reached its peak, it had only just begun. In the immediate aftermath of the hit, the Yamaguchi-Gumi took a moment to mourn. Takenaka Masahisa was honored with a massive funeral, nationally televised by the way, that saw over 1,000 suited-up gangsters descend upon the Taoka mansion. But that entire event had kind of an eerie undertone to it, because the Yamaguchi-Gumi didn't just want a funeral, they wanted revenge. As soon as the mourning period was over, they unanimously appointed Nakanishi Kazuo as the new interim boss and immediately pivoted the entire syndicate toward retaliation. The police could smell the coming conflict from miles away. In a desperate bid to prevent a total collapse of public order, authorities mobilized hundreds of riot police to stand guard over Yakuza offices across the region. And throughout February of 1985, the police conducted a massive sweep, arresting nearly 1,000 gang members and seizing around 50 firearms. But in the end, even a wall of riot shields couldn't hold back the tide for much longer. The Yamaguchi-Gumi's revenge tour began with a brutal statement. They kidnapped an Ichiwakai member, beating him until he revealed the whereabouts of Goto Eiichi, the man who had orchestrated the hit on Takenaka. And that was just the opening act. Throughout the rest of 1985, Japan's Kansai region was transformed into a Yakuza battlefield. Over 200 armed attacks followed in a frantic cycle of kidnapping, street brawls, shootings, and retaliatory strikes. The fighting only paused for a brief 2 months between July and September of 1985, when a truce was agreed by both sides in light of a major sporting event taking place in Kobe. However, the Yamaguchi-Gumi, they didn't sit still during this time. In fact, just as that ceasefire came to an end, they found themselves in some pretty hot water on a global stage. They realized that while they certainly had the numbers to crush their rival, they were missing something vital. You see, the only reason the Ichiwakai was able to survive the fury of the Yamaguchi-Gumi at all was because they held one major tactical advantage this entire time. They had walked off with the majority of the Yamaguchi-Gumi's arsenal back when the big split occurred. Now, with firearm prices having doubled on the black market over the years prior, the Yamaguchi-Gumi was now left in a desperate scramble for firepower, which led them into a high-stakes international smuggling plot that put them into the sights of both the Hong Kong police and US law enforcement in Honolulu. Yamaguchi-Gumi members, some of them very high-ranking, were eventually caught red-handed in a deal, on tape even, in a case that remarkably ended in a not guilty verdict. Still, that entire ordeal had served its purpose for the Ichiwakai. It kept the Yamaguchi-Gumi distracted and disjointed. The conflict persisted into the following year, but if 1985 was the year of violence, 1986 was about to be the year of attempted mediation. Major syndicates like Kyoto's Aise Kotetsukai and Tokyo's Inagawa-kai stepped in to try and broker a peace treaty. For a year, it was a stalemate of proposals. Agreements were reached, then shattered, and it was all back to square one. But then, in February of 1987, a gruesome breakthrough was made. It is believed that one specific event finally pushed both sides toward a ceasefire. On February 2nd, Shiragami Hideo, a business-savvy advisor to the Ichiwakai, was found deceased in the sea off Saipan. Shiragami was a man with big plans for the Northern Mariana Islands, but his end was horrific. Too gruesome for the details to be shared here on YouTube, actually. Yet, even more shocking than the details of his death was the location of the crime scene. Bansai Cliff. Bansai Cliff is a site of dark historical trauma. This is where back in 1944, hundreds of Japanese civilians jumped in order to avoid capture by American troops during World War II. The symbolic weight of taking a Japanese national to that specific site for such a distasteful execution, that was seen as going one step too far, even by the Yamaguchi-Gumi and the Ichiwakai. And so, in the wake of the Saipan incident, the momentum for an agreement became unstoppable. The leading mediator between the two sides was Ishii Susumu, the second-generation boss of Tokyo's Inagawa-kai. Ishii was the prototype of the modern business Yakuza, and he knew that the war was destroying both the image and the bottom line of organized crime. And so, on February 10th, 1987, Ishii personally traveled to Kyoto to deliver the Yamaguchi-Gumi's terms to the Ichiwakai. The Ichiwakai accepted, and the war was officially over. At least on paper, that is. Peace is a fragile thing when you got thousands of gangsters involved. Small skirmishes and internal disagreements, even within the Yamaguchi-Gumi's own ranks, dragged the tension into 1988 and even into 1989. But by then, the Ichiwakai was a ghost of its former self. Overwhelmed by the Yamaguchi-Gumi's sheer manpower and resources, Ichiwakai members defected in droves. By 1988, only 200 men still wore that Ichiwakai pin. And so finally, on March 19, 1989, Yamamoto Hiroshi officially disbanded the Ichiwakai and announced his own retirement. The Yama-Ichi War had lasted over 4 years. It cost an estimated 2 billion yen and claimed 29 lives, with many more injured. But the Yamaguchi-Gumi had emerged victorious, and a month later elected Watanabe Yoshinori as their true 5th-generation leader, entering the 1990s stronger than ever. By 1992, when the US Committee on Governmental Affairs released this detailed report on Asian organized crime, they were 26,000 men strong. To the outside world, it looked like they were invincible. But the true legacy of the Yama-Ichi War wasn't a victory. It was a point of no return. For most of Yakuza history, there had been a social contract with the Japanese. As long as the Yakuza kept their violence among themselves and provided a level of order, the public and the police were ready to, look the other way. The Yama-Ichi War basically shattered that contract. From a stray bullet that hit a civilian in April of 1985 to the officers injured in the line of duty, the violence had simply become too public, too reckless, and too rich. In other words, the Japanese public was fed up. In November of 1985, the bans began. Gangsters were barred from public facilities, and the Boryokudan exclusion movement took root. This public fury gave the government the political cover it needed to push through the Organized Crime Countermeasures Act of 1991. This set of laws was basically the beginning of the end. They tightened the screws on the Yakuza's finances, their recruitment, and their very existence. Now, while the decline of the Yakuza is a complex story of economical changes and shifting social values, the Yama-Ichi War was an important catalyst. It was the final push that forced Japan to finally stop tolerating the underworld and instead start to dismantle it. And so, in that sense, the Yama-Ichi War didn't just decide who would continue the spirit of the Yamaguchi-Gumi. In many ways, it changed the fate of the Yakuza forever. And that's another one in the books. Hey, if you enjoyed this one, let me know by leaving a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one. Want to actively support the creation of this type of content? Well, then please consider checking out my Patreon and becoming a part of a very, very special list of people, including the Hockey Channelman, Sachsenfuchs, D-Fox, Saikajo, Khalid Lebda, Xoyabu, Tricoat, Kevin Hickson, Buns, Michael Smith, RK0, Hajime James, Utku Hussein Kaya, Steve Matsui, Hypanen, Javier Soravia, Midnight Channel, CJ and Mary, Turam, Journeyman 351, Cats and Soup, Chart B-Man, Ben Herodine, White Gilden, Sierran DC, T-Bird, Metal Mama, Boo Boo Cakes, Ian Farmer, Chris Wallace, JR Horse, Adeye Okono, and Guillaume Clément E. Garcia. To you and to anyone who tuned in this time, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.